Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me quite well, and everyone online, I hope you can hear me as well. So good evening and welcome to the third instalment for the Antarctic Futures seminar series. So this seminar series runs alongside the Antarctic Futures exhibition that is being displayed across the road from Early Start at the UOW gallery space. So we've also got children's activities as well that are hosted by Early Start that's happening in this building for most of the weeks leading up until October the 19th when the whole event finishes. So I'd like to introduce myself. I am Melinda Waterman. I'm a researcher here at the University of Wollongong, and I'll be hosting today's session on behalf of the Antarctic Futures organising team. So we meet here today in person on Dharawal country. So first I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. Country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. We acknowledge and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and recognise their rich culture, heritage and continuing relationship with the lands and waters. We acknowledge the custodianship of all the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationship between all living things. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Distinguished Professor Sharon Robinson from the University of Wollongong. Sharon wears many, many hats at UOW. She is the Dean of Researcher Development and Integrity, as well as the Deputy Director within the Australian Research Council funded program called Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future, which you'll see on this slide here. And within this program, she is in charge of science implementation. She is currently a member of the Environmental Effects Assessment Panel of the United Nations Environmental Program and is a faculty member and science theme leader for the Homeward Bound 2019 Women's Leadership Program. Sharon has visited Antarctica 14 times since 1996, when she began her research into Antarctic mosses. She recently wrote an essay called Among Ancient Moss Forests, which has been featured in the latest Griffith Review. Tonight, she'll share some of her amazing Antarctica ventures and the discoveries her and her team have made along the way. Thank you very much, Sharon. This presentation will be recorded and will be available on the Antarctic Futures website. So please welcome Sharon as she shares her stories of Antarctic mosses.
Thank you very much, Mel, and it's great to be here and giving one of the Antarctic Futures seminars. And I'm particularly glad to be in the Early Start building, and isn't this a great lecture theatre? So it's lovely to be here this evening. And I'd like to thank Georgia and Mel and Brogan for organising this series. And I was supposed to bring a copy of the Griffith Review and I forgot, but the August edition has a whole load of stories around Antarctica and people's experience of them. So that's a really nice way to learn about Antarctica from a more sort of more on the humanities side in terms of people's experiences. So I'm going to start my talk by thanking the teams, because most of the work that I'm going to talk about and the work that we've done in our program here at Wollongong has been done by many early career researchers. And some of the people are here tonight, so I won't be able to find people, but Crystal and Georgia are here. They were with me in Antarctica this summer, and Mel's up here. So a number of people in the room have been with me working in this Antarctic space, and it's down to them that we've been able to do such great work. So I'm going to start off with how we get to Antarctica. So a bit of an introduction to how do you get to Antarctica if you're a researcher. And this is actually a picture of the Aurora Australis. It was decommissioned a few years ago, but this was the ship that I first went down to in Antarctica in 1996. And so it had a long and proud history taking Antarctic expeditions down to the continent and Macquarie Island. And it's been recently the Australian Antarctic Division has built a new ship, which is currently in dry dock being fixed, but that is bigger and better. But the Aurora did sterling work for many decades. And this is a number of us on the ship leaving Hobart. So there's Mount Wellington behind, and this is Paul Keller, who some of you might know from chemistry. But this is us leaving Hobart, going down the Derwent River. And then you get into the Southern Ocean, and you've got 3,500 kilometres of ocean to get to Antarctica. So it's a long way from Hobart. And this is a picture from the very top deck of the ship, and you can see the waves breaking over the bow of the ship. So very large seas, very big ocean, a lot of rocking and rolling. Lots of people are quite sick for the first few days, but then hopefully it settles down, and the rest of the journey is quite fun. And during the voyage, there's lots of entertainment in terms of lifeboat drills. So here we all are with our life jackets on, lined up on the deck, doing a drill to make sure that if there was an emergency, we could get off the ship in time. So when you get to Antarctica, one of the things that's really amazing is you obviously have really big icebergs around, but also the fact that you start to see sea ice forming. And so this is the beginnings of sea ice forming, where the surface of the water is just starting to freeze on the surface. And you can see little bits of pancake ice here, but a sort of white coating over the top where the sea ice is starting to form. And when the ship gets to the point where it can't go through the ice anymore, if it can't get into the bay where the station is, then you get a helicopter ride off over those amazing icebergs. And on the first time we went down, we had we were about 90 kilometers off station, and so we got this great helicopter ride into the station over sea ice and over icebergs. And that was amazing. My first helicopter ride, so that was very exciting. You get other forms of ice, like these frazzle ice pieces where the sea ice is broken up into, like a mirror, breaking up into small sections. And here you can see, again, ice, areas of water, small bergy bits, and then larger icebergs. And this is actually the continent up behind us there. And there is Casey Station. So this is the bay, and this is the station. And all of the Australian stations are colour-coded with these primary colour buildings. So the red building is the building that you sleep in. The yellow building is the science building or the operations building. The orange building is the workshop. So, and the green store is the place where all the beer and the eggs and the food are kept. And in Antarctica, you have to keep some foods warm. So it's not a case of necessarily just keeping everything cold. For some bits of food, it's actually a case of keeping them warm so they don't freeze. It's a little bit different to being in Australia. This is the sort of helicopter that we often get moved around, either at the stations or from the ship to the shore. And this is waiting to get onto a helicopter, so waiting until the pilot tells us it's safe to get onto the helicopter. More recently, over the last 10 years or a little bit longer, the Australian Antarctic Division has actually flown from Hobart to near Casey Station. And this is actually a view from the front of the Airbus that we fly down on. This was one of the times when we were actually allowed into the cockpit. And so this is the view that the pilots flying down to Antarctica get to see on their way back and forth from Antarctica. And this is an iceberg that's probably several kilometers long in a huge piece of sea ice. And so you're flying over this really, really high, but you've got this amazing view of the sea ice and the icebergs below. And the plane lands on the ice, and the ice gets to be up to 4 kilometers thick, but it's probably more than a kilometer, but you're landing on this massive piece of ice. And it's a normal-ish Airbus, so it's probably like the ones that you may have flown around in Australia, and it has wheels. It's quite unusual to have one that's landing with wheels on ice. This is the team that went in with SAFE this year. So this is us having just got off the Airbus, all very excited to have actually landed in Antarctica. And then sometimes you get flown around in smaller planes if you're going from one station to another within Antarctica. And so this is a small plane that we were flying onto Davis. So Antarctica is a tough place, whether you're a plant, which is what we study, or an explorer. And this is one of the pictures from Hurley's pictures from near Cape Denison, from the hut that Mawson built at Cape Denison. And this is just to show a blizzard. So this is old black and white photographs from more than 100 years ago. And these explorers are actually out there cutting blocks of ice to melt for water, because that's how, in the field, that's how you get your water for drinking and food and so on. This is me standing outside on the red shed deck, so a lot less scary, but this is actually a view out across the bay, but you can see that you can't see the sea at all, because the snow is being blown around by the wind, and that in those blizzard conditions you really can't see. And it gets so bad that you can't see if I had my hand held out like that, I wouldn't be able to see my hand. And when it's that windy, you actually can't tell which way is up or down. It messes with your balance because of your effect on your ears, and it's really easy to just fall over. It sounds crazy, but it's quite frightening when you actually experience. So that's a bad day. These are nice days where at the top and the bottom where it's sunny, it's maybe 0, 1, 2 degrees air temperature, not very warm, hence all the clothes we're wearing, but very, very still conditions. And these are the sorts of days when we can actually get out on boats and travel around the area on small inflatable boats. But there's always the chance that a blizzard will blow up and it will quickly become like this and this, and you have to be inside, sometimes for days. So if the blizzard happens, you might be locked up in the accommodation building for many days till it blows away. So we work at a place called near Casey Station, one of the Australian bases. So there are 3 continental stations, Casey, Mawson and Davis. Many thousands of kilometres between them. So we can't just pop over and visit one of the other stations. They're too far away to go and visit. And we work there because we like to call it the Daintree of continental Antarctica. It has some of the best developed plants for the whole of Antarctica. And so it's a really good place to go as a plant biologist because there are these great plants, but I will show you what that means in terms of the diversity. So please don't expect a rainforest. This is the sort of expansive green moss beds that we see. So this is all moss and this is water, and you can actually probably see some bubbles on the top there where the mosses and the algae are all making oxygen in photosynthesis and bubbling away happily in the summer months. So who lives at Casey? Who lives in Casey's backyard? When we think about Antarctica, we mostly actually think about things like penguins and seals. But things like the Adelie penguins and these seals are animals that come to breed in Antarctica. So they come in for the summer, they breed, and then they leave again. They don't stay for the winter, usually. The things that hang around in the winter include the emperor penguins, which nest on the sea ice and have their penguin creches of little emperor penguins. You can see all the snow that's been blown onto them in a blizzard, so pretty rough conditions for a small bird. They're hardened Antarctic animals. But then you also have the mosses that we work on and the lichens, the terrestrial vegetation. It can survive there all through the year on the land. And it does this because it's able to freeze and dry out. And when it's frozen dry, it can survive pretty much any conditions. So the temperatures can drop to -40, -80, that's okay. As long as it's dry, it can cope with those conditions. most plants that we see out here wouldn't be able to cope with that. So if you took a plant from out there, or if you take a piece of lettuce and you put it in your freezer, it's going to end up like a mushy mess. Mosses are able to survive that freeze drying process and stay frozen. And they can, in some cases, can be buried for hundreds of years. And then if a glacier retreats and they get uncovered again, they can grow again. So amazingly tough plants. And inside the mosses, there are little animals. This is a tardigrade. It's an electron micrograph of a tardigrade, so it's taken through an electron microscope. Tiny little animals. It's on a moss leaf for scale. So if you imagine how small a moss is, and then you try to think how small a moss leaf might be, these are very, very small animals. But they can also freeze dry, and you can actually send tardigrades out into space and mosses because they're that tough. So in the backyard of Casey, and it literally is in the backyard, this is the accommodation building, this is the pump house where the water for the station is stored, and behind that there's a melt lake, and in those melt lakes you get cyanobacterial mats, you get terrestrial algae, so these are like ulva that you might know on the beach, the sea lettuce that you might see on the beach, but it's growing in lakes and on land. It loves penguin colonies and penguin poo. There's mosses around the edge of the water, and then as you go up the slope, there are lichens growing on old dead mosses that have been growing in the past, but it's now got too dry, and so the lichens are growing over the top of them. And this is another lichen, Usnea, which is all over the mosses and all over the rocks in the drier areas. And then if you go to the drier areas, even higher up the hill, you'll find rocks covered in lichens. So these are black hairy lichens, the Usnea, some fluffy lichens there, and also some orange and yellow ones. So a number of different species of lichens all growing on the rocks. And mosses are the dominant plant form in Antarctica because they have this ability to freeze and thaw. And so this is Mel and colleagues on this peninsula, and you can see these really nice big chunks of moss, these big moss banks that grow on the peninsula region, up in the bit that's close to South America and is the warm part of Antarctica. And this is a view of that whole, one of those very large moss areas in there. Now on the peninsula, you actually do get two vascular plants. So there's this little grass plant, Dischampsia, and there's Colobanthus, a little cushion plant, but you still get amazing lichens. And so even in the peninsula, the lichens are the best sorts of vegetation and the most extensive vegetation. And if you go further inland, you might expect there wouldn't be anything, but inland there are actually mountains, and the tops of the mountains reach up through the ice, and we call those nunataks. And on the tops of nunataks, and these aren't my pictures because unfortunately I wasn't in the helicopter that went to this amazing spot, but if you go to the tops of these nunataks, there are lichens, and that's a glove for scale. And here's a river of moss where there's a bank of snow that's been melting and provided water for the mosses to grow. So these are growing on the top of a mountain, poking out through the snow, miles, kilometers inland from the sea. And there again is the moss growing in more detail. So mosses and lichens can survive these incredibly tough conditions. They grow, pretty much any rock that you find in Antarctica will probably have lichens on it. And there's going to be those animals, those tardigrades and those other animals inside those moss banks in those really cold places, all over Antarctica. We work on mosses, so you can find mosses under rocks. So if the conditions are really bad, the plants will go underneath the rock. So I've just turned this rock over. So if you imagine a quartz rock with the light coming through it, makes a nice little greenhouse if the conditions are really bad. So the mosses and lichens and algae will go under the rock so that they can survive where there's a little bit of moisture and the wind's not so bad and the conditions are a little bit better. If the conditions are really good, you get big, expansive areas of moss. So these might be several meters across. They have to be able to cope with freezing all the time. So this is a piece of moss with an ice, a layer of ice over all around it, a little island of moss in the ice. Where conditions are quite tough, you'll get buttons. So this is a penguin, a bit of a penguin feather. It's the end of a penguin feather for scale, but that's a little tiny button of moss growing in a little bit of drainage channel on some rock. And these are actually pillars of moss growing inside a freshwater lake near Schwoyer Station. And so divers actually go into these lakes and swim around these moss pillars. And again, that's somebody else's photograph, and I've never gone diving in amongst the moss pillars, but they are meters high, and the mosses are thousands of years old, and they've been growing in these freshwater lakes around Schwoyer Station. So mosses grow anywhere where they can get water, pretty much anywhere where they can get meltwater in the summer. All the water has to come from snow that's frozen through the winter, but then melts in the summer. And so when the water melts, when the snow melts, ice melts, and the water runs over the mosses, you get photosynthesis happening. And this picture actually has a thin layer of ice over the top. So these mosses are actually photosynthesizing and producing oxygen, even though the conditions that they're in are probably a water temperature of about maybe 4 degrees. So incredibly cold to be doing that. And even in the summer, they have to be able to cope with each night the water freezing. So this is a stream with moss along it, and every night the ice in the water in the stream freezes and you get ice. And so this is probably about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. The mosses are still coping with all that freezing water around them. So they need water, they need light, and the other thing they need is nutrients. And we think the reason why the mosses are so extensive at Casey is actually because thousands of years ago, penguins were nesting on the sites that now are really good moss beds. And the evidence for this is, if you look at this, you can see there's lots and lots of tiny rocks that have been scattered all over this landscape. And they've been moved there by penguins. So Adelie penguins build nests out of little rocks that they can put in their beak and move around. And these rocks are actually all the nests, previous nest sites for where Adelie penguins were nesting. And where they nest, they do lots of pooing. So there's a lot of guano around, lots and lots of rich nutrients. And because it's Antarctica, it's freeze-dried guano, and it lasts for thousands of years. And so this is a modern day penguin colony. You can see lots of sort of silty guano, and it looks pretty messy. These are the penguin little size penguin rocks that they make their nests out of. But these were deposited 3,000 to 8,000 years ago. The penguins that were actually there making the nests and depositing the guano were there all those thousands of years ago. The penguins now are on islands just off the coast or on the very tips of the peninsulas that stick out into the sea. And we've got sometimes 3 ridges of along the tops of valleys where the penguins used to nest. And these have been dated by carbon dating. People have found egg shells, bones, all sorts of bits of dead penguin. Remains from those 3,000 to 8,000 year old penguin colonies. And so the furthest one from the sea might have been abandoned 8,000 years ago. The next ridge might have been abandoned 5,000 years ago. And 3,000 years ago, the nearest ridge to the sea was where the penguins were sitting. As the ice retreats, the land rises up and the penguins move closer and closer to the sea. They don't want to be walking a long way to get their food. So the penguins keep moving towards the sea, and they abandon those old colonies as the ice retreats and the land rises up through isostatic uplift. And we can see the how important those nutrients are in that the 3 peninsulas along the Casey, along the Windmill Islands coastline near Casey that support rich moss beds all have evidence of penguins being there 3,000 to 8,000 years ago. And the one peninsula where we find lichens but not mosses doesn't have that evidence of the penguin colonies. So we think that that big nutrient load that the penguins left behind, it's like blood and bone meal for mosses. That's what's feeding these great moss beds. So the other thing that we've wondered about for a long time is how on earth does a plant survive when the air temperature very, very rarely gets above 2 degrees. So on a summer's day, the air temperature is normally still only 1 or 2 degrees above freezing. That's very, very cold for a plant to be making a lot of energy. And we've been measuring the tops of the moss surface temperatures for many years and noticing that the mosses would get up to 25 degrees or 30 degrees on a sunny day. So this graph just shows the moss surface temperature over the course of the day. And on a sunny day, we get 25 to 30 degrees in the middle of the day. On a cloudy day, it still gets up to about 10 degrees. Overnight, it drops below 0. But both of these days, the air temperature didn't get above 2 degrees. So the air temperature is measured in these Wilkinson screens that are 1.5 meters above the ground. That temperature would have been 2 degrees, but the mosses were sitting at 25 to 30 degrees. That makes a lot more sense because that's the sort of temperature that those plants would be photosynthesizing optimally here. And when we measure the optimum temperature for photosynthesis and productivity for a moss, and this was work done by Alicia Pereira when she was visiting us from Spain, we find that they're happiest when the temperatures are over 14 degrees. So their surface temperature is over 14 degrees, but that only happens for 3% of their summer at the moment. So think about that, because I'll come back to how fast they grow. And you might think if they're only getting good conditions for 3% of their summer, it's probably going to be quite slow. So this is me in 1996, the first time I went down with Jane Wasley, who was my first PhD student here at Wollongong and now works at the Antarctic division. And this is me with Crystal and Georgia this year when we went down in February. And this is a moss bed sign that we got put up so that people wouldn't drive over our moss beds. Very important, because in the winter, when everything's covered with snow, people might actually drive over them and do them some damage. So we've been working on them since 1996. I started off looking at how the mosses were affected, or whether they were affected by the ozone hole and depletion of ozone and the increased UV. And some work that Joanna Turnbull did in her PhD, and Joanna's now a lecturer here at UOW. She was looking at how well protected the mosses were from ultraviolet radiation. The ultraviolet has increased because of ozone depletion. But what we found was that when the mosses were in that dry state that they go into to survive the winter, they're actually really tolerant of UVB. And we had to give them many, many times more ultraviolet radiation than they would ever see in order to find any DNA damage. So they've got some really super moss properties in terms of surviving elevated UVB. The ozone hole is still happening. So this is the ozone hole over Antarctica in September 1979. This is how big it was in October 2021. And I'm putting these up because sometimes people think that, well, we've got the Montreal Protocol and we've stopped releasing the compounds that are destroying the ozone hole, so maybe it's all recovered. We have done that. We have stopped producing more of those compounds that will damage the ozone layer. But the problem is that those reactions, once they're set in motion, go on for a very long time. There's a very long lag time. And so we don't expect the ozone layer to recover to the levels it was prior to the 1970s until 2060. That's the lag time. When you mess up things in the climate system, the lag time for recovery is really slow. And that's a really important lesson for us in terms of climate change, because even when we stop producing extra carbon. There's a lot in the atmosphere, and there's a long lead time around the damage that that can do. So going back to the UVB does cause damage to mosses. We did this by screening out. If we screen out the UVB and they don't have any, the mosses have perky green shoots and look very happy. And if we let them have the normal amount of UV, so this is what they get each spring, it's not extra, then they are yellow, which means that the chlorophyll is being destroyed, and they're producing more protective compounds, carotenoids, that help them to protect against UVB damage. And Joanna actually identified that they actually show leaf damage too. So the leaves are tiny, and Joanna did a lot of microscopy work to show that the leaves are actually damaged as well. And this is a confocal microscope image of the leaves of the ceratodon here. And this is a healthy shoot that's been growing without UV. And you can see that each little cell has little round blobs in, and those round blobs are chloroplasts. They're the things that do photosynthesis. And red round ones are happy chloroplasts. This one has much less red. So the yellow is not so much chlorophyll, which makes sense because these are yellow. They haven't got as much chlorophyll, but you can also see that there's lots of cells where there's none of that fluorescent signal, which tells us there's lots of cells where the chloroplasts have actually been destroyed. So UV is damaging to the mosses at the current levels. They're happier if they're in more shady conditions and don't get as much UV. And so Melinda and many other people in the lab have worked on what the compounds are that the mosses can produce to protect themselves. So some of the plants that we work on, some of the mosses, produce sunscreen pigments that they put in their cell walls. And that's the way that they're able to protect from UVB damage. And two of the species do this particularly well. But the third species, which is the one that I was showing you before, has less tolerance and is more damaged by UVB. And that's the endemic species. It's the only species that's only found in Antarctica. The two species that are a little bit tougher are ones that we actually get here or in other places around the world. But we found that they mostly produce cell wall compounds. The same species, when it's growing here, puts those compounds inside the cell. So the Antarctic mosses do something special with their sunscreen compounds. They put them inside the wall to protect themselves. We think that gives them extra protection. So sometimes the moss will be this red because it's got so many protective compounds in it. There's a piece where we've taken a rock off and it was growing in a very shady environment. And this is what this is the sort of sun damage that the mosses are experiencing. And these are pictures that Mel took where here's some of that green moss, and you can see all the red in the cell walls, the red compounds that the mosses are producing to protect themselves. So some of the mosses can protect themselves. Other species that only grow in Antarctica can be damaged by UV. What we've been doing more recently is looking at whether we can use mosses to tell us more about how the climate is changing and has changed around Antarctica. And this is important because weather stations are relatively rare around Antarctica. This map shows you all the places where they do collect climate data. All that climate data is collected at 1.5 meters. It's not collected at ground level. Some of it's collected for the summer only, and some of it's all year. And most of it has been only collected for a few decades, and there's a few places where weather records, climate records go back to the 1960s. So in International Glaciology Year, which was 1957, many scientific expeditions went to Antarctica, stations were set up, and climate monitoring was actually put in place. So that's how far back the records go. So we don't have any 100-year records like we do for places in Australia or other places around the world. So can mosses help to tell us what the climate's been doing around the coast of Antarctica where they grow? And what can they tell us about the climate if they can? So in order to do this, we first had to be able to date the mosses. So nobody actually knew how old these mosses were. And we thought, well, maybe we can use radiocarbon dating to date them. And this is based on the principle that the mosses grow sequentially. So the bottom of the moss is like the middle of a tree, and the top of the moss is like the outside of the tree. And they don't make rings, but they're basically laying down some carbon each year as they grow. They don't have any vascular tissue. So the reason they can freeze is because they don't have a plumbing system, but that also means they can't move carbon around their bodies. So they can't move the carbon from one year to another, which means that the carbon dates should stay exactly where they were laid down. And that's the principle of this carbon dating. And we use radiocarbon, the 14 carbon. And in particular, there's a very high resolution record of that, because in the 1950s and 60s, when atmospheric nuclear testing was happening, we released radioactivity in the atmosphere as a result of the nuclear weapons that were being tested. And radiocarbon spread around the globe, very, very low levels, but that radiocarbon spread all over the globe. And anything that photosynthesizes takes up that carbon and lays it down in its body somewhere. And the mosses should lay down the carbon from the 1950s and 60s in the bit of the moss that was growing in the 1950s and 60s. And the peak of the radiocarbon bomb pulse is in the mid-1960s. And since then it's declined because of nuclear test bans. So once we stopped testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, the radiocarbon signature is slowly decaying. But we've got this nice peak that very accurately tells us when 1965 was. And here's one of those bomb pulse peaks from our mosses. So this is a piece of one of the moss species growing outside the red shed, the accommodation building at Casey. We picked it in 2010, and there's 1965, and we can trace it back, and it was growing back in the 1940s or 50s was when this piece started growing. And this would have been a piece that was about 5 or 6 centimetres long. And the station at Casey was built in the 1980s. So it predates the record at Casey by several decades. And using this method, Melinda and another PhD student, Lawrence Clark, have measured the date, and colleagues at ANSTO that we work with, Quan Hu and others that we work with at ANSTO, we've measured the dates for several chunks of moss from around the continent, both from the Casey region and also from the other side of the continent on the peninsula, the warm bit. And this is how fast they grow. So 0.3 on average, 0.3 to 3 millimeters a year. So 3 millimeters is fast growth for moss, and 0.3 is slow. And some of them are growing like 0.1 millimeter a year if it's a bad year. So that's the average rate. So these pieces that are 10 centimeters long or that sort of depth can be potentially several hundred years old. And this is one of our oldest moss shoots. So at Stevenson's Cove, which is the best moss bed in the Windmill Islands, which is the best place for moss on the continent probably, this shoot, there's the bomb pulse, that's 1965. We can go all the way back. It was growing in the 1600s. So it's been growing for several hundred years. And that piece was about 13 centimeters long. So they're still growing very slowly. It's a very small plant, but these really are ancient moss forests, because if we have 500-year-old trees, we're pretty impressed that they've been growing that long. So these plants have been growing for that sort of time. They predate all the exploration of Antarctica. They've been there all that time. So we also use other isotopes of carbon. So there's some of the stable isotopes of carbon, 13 carbon and 12 carbon, and that helps to tell us how wet or dry it was at the time the moss was growing. And from that, we've been able to show that 80% of the mosses that we found so far here in East Antarctica show a drying trend. So they're able to tell us that the area that they're growing in has got drier in the last, since the 1960s. So they are able to tell us what their climate's doing. And what we want to do is see if we can use other isotopes like oxygen isotopes to help us understand more about that climate record that the mosses are preserving. And this is work that Mel did with Jessica Bramley-Ouse, who's another PhD student. So we've got these long shoots that might be hundreds of years old, can be hundreds of years old. We can trace that record of the climate down them. And one of the things that we were able to show from this is that for the first time, we were able to show that in East Antarctica, the mosses are actually being affected by changes in their climate, because we can see that all of these mosses are growing under drier conditions than they were 40 or 50 or 60 years ago. And the reason that they're showing these changes is actually in part because of the ozone hole and ozone depletion. Because when we have a big ozone hole, it actually, it does several things. One of the things it does is pull the winds. It helps to pull the westerly winds, the big wet wind jets that go around Antarctica, closer in towards Antarctica. So it's got windier. That wall of wind that's going around Antarctica is one of the things that helps to keep Antarctica cold. So it's actually helped to keep most of Antarctica colder than it would have been if it hadn't been for ozone depletion. This is all a bit ironic, but it has, where the winds go over the continent on the peninsula, that is one of the reasons why that area is warming really rapidly, because the warm water from the ocean is being dragged over that part of Antarctica and warming it up and making it one of the fastest warming parts of the planet. It's very like the Arctic in terms of very fast global warming. So we've got, where we're working at Casey though, we've got stronger winds and colder conditions, or we have had up until now. And that's what's causing this drying, because if you have more wind, it evaporates away more water. And if it's colder, you've got more of the water locked away as ice. And so those two conditions make less water available for the mosses to drink each summer. So what we're doing now is trying to see how extensive that is by flying drones. And hopefully the drone is not going to move. That's a bit of a shame. Or maybe it will if I do that. No? Okay. You have to imagine that the drone is flying. We use drones with different sensors on to map the mosses, but also with hyperspectral and multispectral sensors to give us moss health indices. And so this is a measure of how much chlorophyll there is in the image, so how much greenness there is, but also how much water, because parts of this image have green, but because they're disconnected from the melting snow, they're actually dry. And so they're moss that's sitting there, dry, still green, but not doing anything because it's too dry, it can't actually grow. And so the areas where the moss is healthiest, this is the moss health index, red is stressed, blue is healthy moss, they correspond to where the water is draining off the ice and across the moss beds. And so we can see that how important that water is, and that water availability is to healthy moss beds. So we use drones to map and monitor that, but we've also this year put in some of these TOM sensors. So these are little temperature sensors where the probes go down into the soil. We can measure what the depth, the temperature and the water availability are at depths through the soil. And they also measure the air temperature on the stem. So we get to know what the surface moss temperature is. And we've left those out. So this is the first time that they've been left in the Antarctica. We're hoping that when we go back, they're still collecting data and that we can download it. But this will give us an idea of what the temperature does over the winter and all those months when we're not there. When we go to Antarctica, we're usually only there for 3 weeks. So we have no idea what the mosses are getting up to when we're not there. And this is just to illustrate another way in which we know that those mosses are drying out. So this is actually quite a short-term study that In 2003, we set up a state of the environment monitoring system, and we've been going back and photographing the mosses whenever we've been able to get there. These are little squares that are 25 by 25 centimetres. And you can see that they were nice and green in 2003 when we started. 2008, everything had gone red and stressed. 2011, they were looking even worse. 2012, they were still looking pretty bad. 2013, 2014, they'd started to green up a little bit more. So we've done this for quadrats over time. We went back this summer and took more photographs. So this is a long-term measure of how those individual moss beds are doing. And again, that's another indication that we can see from the amount of green and red that the mosses are less healthy than they were. And what we're worried about, the other bit of evidence that we have is that we can see that the moss species are changing. So when we started doing this in 2000 and 2003, only 2 mosses were growing in the bottom of the wettest parts. The endemic species, the species that only grows in Antarctica, that's represented by the green spiky one, and the fat yellow one is called Bryum, and that's a cosmopolitan moss that grows all over the world. You get a little bit of Bryum, but mostly you'd see Schistidium, and the grey things are dead moss. And we have another species, Ceratodon, this one with the red stem, doesn't like getting its feet wet, will not grow underwater. And it was never in those low areas because we actually did a transplant experiment and we put it in the wet site and it dies within 6 weeks. So we know it can't grow underwater. And over time, between 2011 and 2013, more and more of that Ceratodon, the third species, moved into those areas. So that's a sort of third line of evidence to say these bits are getting drier because they're dry enough now that Ceratodon can survive in those spaces. And so we've got an Antarctic specialist, the Schistidium antarctica, being replaced by these 2 global commoner species. And what we're worried about is that our healthy green moss beds might end up looking like this. This is 1,000 kilometres to the west at Davis Station in the Vestfold Hills. This is what those moss beds looked like in 1998. This is 2005 and 2018, and in 2020 it looked much the same. So in other parts of Antarctica, very, very large areas of mosses are just going grey and brown. And we think this is that drying trend that we are observing. We're observing at Casey, but it's further along. It's been going for longer. These areas are drier to start with, so they're further along that negative trajectory. And as I said, this is linked in with the ozone hole changing the climate above Antarctica. There's climate change pushing those westerly winds closer to Antarctica as well. So there's 2 pressures, ozone depletion and climate change, that are causing this change in the winds and these changes in climate around Antarctica. And these are all the climatic or biological factors that are linked to that shift in the westerly winds. So it's a really significant change that's happened over the last few decades. The westerly winds being shifted south. For some animals, like the albatross, it's actually a positive because if it's stronger winds, you don't have to put so much effort into gliding. You can just move along on the wind. And so for albatross, it's actually been a positive. The albatross mothers are a whole kilometre heavier than they were before the winds increased. So it's not always negative. It depends on the animal or plant in question. And it depends where the animals and plants live, whether the wind shift has been positive for them or negative. But it's having massive effects all over the southern hemisphere. And the other big threat that has become more apparent just recently is the risk of climate warming in Antarctica. So I said that Antarctica had been quite protected by those westerly winds and the strengthening of those, and the ozone hole actually helping to pull them closer to Antarctica. But recently we've seen heat waves in Antarctica. So in 2000, there was heat waves all around Antarctica all through the summer, and Casey Station actually showed its highest record ever of almost 90, close to 99 degrees. And on the peninsula, the highest temperature ever in Antarctica was recorded, which was 18.3 degrees. So that's up here on the peninsula, but that was the highest recorded temperature ever in Antarctica. And then this, that heat wave went around from December, January and February in 2020. And then this year, there was a massive heat wave in March where warm, moist air moved down from Australia, from just off Australia, right the way down and into Antarctica. And the temperatures that in March were inland were close to 40 degrees above the normal temperatures. And so increasingly, climate change and heating are actually affecting the surface temperatures in Antarctica. And that was an article that we wrote for the conversation about the heat wave in March. So the other thing that we're really keen to do, and that's with colleagues like Pascal, who's in the audience here, is to set up an observing system around Antarctica so that we get data all the time to tell us how the moss beds are doing and the other plants and animals. And so the idea with this is that we would have sensors in the ground and on the ground that are beaming data back to us here in Australia or all around the world. So you might have sensors that are going into the ocean, sensors that are running across the moss beds. The data would be transmitted via towers, and those could connect to satellites, and that data could come back to us in real time. So that's what we'd really like to have, because that would enable us to study these things all through the year and to know what's going on all through the year and not just when we're down there. And the other thing that we're really concerned about is what's going to happen as ice-free areas open up across Antarctica. So all of the plants that I've talked about are growing in these ice-free areas where there is snow melt in the summer and there's rock and water exposed. But these are going to expand in size with that climate warming that we're seeing. And what does that mean? And we've just written a paper in Global Change Biology to say, well, so what is going to happen as those ice-free areas increase? Is that going to be good news for plants and animals, or is it going to mean that the water supplies get disconnected from the mosses and the animals that are living in them, and therefore it gets drier, as we've seen at Casey? What does it mean in terms of species being able to move into those areas? So one of the big concerns is invasive species getting into Antarctica and actually surviving as there's more spaces that open up. So we're part of Securing Antarctica's Environmental Future, which is a very big research program all across Australia and the world. And these are some of our partners. And the ones that I've circled here are the ones that are actually involved in the studies that I've been talking about. So I'd like to thank all of those collaborators. And it's really, Antarctic science is a really international endeavour. So we work with many colleagues internationally. It's one of the great things about Antarctica, that it is a place devoted to peace and science. And so that enables us to work with colleagues from around the world and do research. And so it's great to have this opportunity within SAFE to look forward to doing that research in Antarctica and working towards preserving Antarctica and securing Antarctica's environmental future. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was amazing. Thank you very much for sharing your decades of expertise in Antarctica. So we do have some time for questions, and a lot of the details that you talked about is actually timely for World Ozone Day, which is next Friday, the 16th of September. We do have pizza coming as well, but we have time for questions. So in the room, please raise your hand. Anyone online, please just type in the Q&A box and we'll address your questions as soon as possible. Yes, Brogan.
I'm just wondering whether mosses, some species, I guess, must be more capable of dealing with changing environment, temperature variations and so on. Where would you categorize mosses in that space? Are they perhaps more robust than other creatures down there, or not creatures, other living things?
They have a really high tolerance of adverse conditions because they can dry out. And so when they're dry, if you've been into the desert, you've probably seen mosses in the desert. So mosses and lichens also grow in hot deserts. So when they're dry, they can survive hot conditions or cold conditions. When they're wet, they're just as sensitive as anything else. And they're probably actually more sensitive in the wet state than other vascular plants. So they're not necessarily, in the summer when they're hydrated, they're probably as vulnerable as other plants are to changing conditions, but they can cope with those really extreme conditions if they're in that dry state. That's why they're able to dry out, desiccate, and then freeze, or dry out and survive. We know that the same species can grow in the deserts in Australia and survive +50 when it's dry, as -40 when it's in Antarctica. But it has to be dry to survive that. If you freeze it when it's wet, it's only really tolerant to maybe -3 or 4. So it's a sort of it's an avoidance mechanism rather than an actual ability to survive those conditions when it's live, when it's metabolically active. Yeah.
Any other questions for Sharon? Yes.
You mentioned that the sunscreen in Antarctica, they put it in the cell walls, and elsewhere it's just in the actual cell. Do you know whether that's phenotypic, or has there been some sort of divergence there?
An evolutionary thing. That's a really good question, and we don't know what the mechanism is for where it is in the cell. Most higher plants, so most of the plants out there, if they have sunscreen compounds, they'll be inside the cell in the vacuole, and so that's the normal place to put those compounds. We know that the same species of moss growing in Antarctica will put it in the cell walls, and if it's growing here, it will put it in the inside its cells, which suggests that it's a phenotypic response and not a genetic, not because of the genes. Although there is some debate about whether the species in Australia and the species in Antarctica are exactly the same. So, we don't know for sure, but we think it's the only plants, the plants that we know of that do, the vascular plants that we know of, the higher plants that do this, put the pigments in the cell walls, are ones that grow in the Arctic. And so it may be that it's actually a response that plants that grow in cold environments have adapted and used. So particularly evergreen plants that grow in the Arctic would also put the same sorts of compounds in their cell walls. So it may be a phenotypic adjustment to those sorts of environmental conditions.
Yeah, nice question. Any other questions from the room? Yes, Pascal?
Just following on this one. So where's the research in terms of genetic sequencing of the moss to see whether there's a genetic marker there or it's just epigenetic only?
Yeah, I don't think there is any. There's a little bit of genetic work of that type done in some model moss species, but that species, the species that they do that genetic work, doesn't grow in Antarctica. So the ones that we work on, some of those have had their genome sequenced, but there hasn't been much in the way of epigenetic research or understanding the compounds that are the expression of the compounds. It's a little bit tricky because the plants are so small, so getting samples that you can actually do some of those studies will be tricky. And you probably have to do it by growing the material in controlled environments and doing it that way. but basically it hasn't been done. And it's a really interesting question. It'd be good to, we need to, when we get that container, so we're actually building a wind tunnel that we can maintain at really cold conditions so that we can simulate the Antarctic environment. And we have a new chamber that will allow us to go down to, is it -80? Anyway, cold. So we've got a couple of places now where we can actually grow plants in similar conditions to what they have in Antarctica. And so that will be a good place to do some of these studies in terms of understanding how those environmental factors change the moss physiology and biochemistry.
Great question, Pascal. But more things to do. You're adding more things to our list. Any questions for those online? Please post them into the Q&A box. Any other questions in the room? Yes, Miguel?
Besides of the UV impact in the plants, they have another problems like pathogenic fungus or bacteria that affect the mosses?
Another good question. There's definitely fungi down there. We don't know much about fungal diseases or diseases that the mosses might have, but one of the cushion plants that grows on Macquarie Island has recently been really severely impacted by a combination of climate change and also the opportunity that's given to pathogenic fungi to do more damage. And so there's an endemic cushion plant on Macquarie Island called Azarella that has suffered severe dieback, and it's because those shifting winds have taken the water away, and as it dries out, it's much less resilient to the fungal pathogens. And so that's another thing that in those pictures I showed of the grey-brown moss around the lake area, those things might be, that might be a combination of both drying and disease that's able to take over because the conditions have got so tough. Great question. We actually don't know what microbes are in the mosses yet. It's a good area to research. There's been some work done on that in the peninsula. One of the Brazilian teams, when they moved their station, they did quite a bit of work around what microbes were living in the mosses.
Nice.
Excellent questions. Thank you very much. There are no further questions online, so I'd like everyone to please thank Sharon for sharing her lovely talk with us today. So thank you again, Sharon.